Please be seated. Imagine for a moment that you are in the storm. Maybe your imagination takes you back to the sea when you were with Jesus and the disciples, and there are other boats around you all being thrashed about by the sudden wind. Maybe you can envision something a little more modern. Maybe you've been out on a sailboat or through your own service. You've been on a ship, and you know what it feels like when the storms rage and the clouds burst, and you begin to fear for your life. What safety equipment do you imagine yourself reaching for in that moment? If you imagine back to a more ancient times, or really just any time more than 100 years ago, perhaps you're thinking about rope, something to either tie down a sail or something else that might thrash about, or simply tie yourself to the mast so that you don't go overboard. Or if you want to be a little bit more modern, maybe you reach for a life jacket, you reach for a flare or some kind of radio equipment, something that allows you to contact someone who can help you, or to mine the weather, or just pump out the water. As we know from the gospel passage, that boat was filling with water. Well, what piece of safety equipment did Jesus reach for in that moment? He reached for a pillow. Not exactly the first thing that comes to mind for me as the disciples were rushing about for fear that they would perish on that day. They look over and Jesus is asleep. He's asleep on a cushion. Of course, that stands out to us because a pillow is a symbol not of safety, but of comfort. And it stands out not only in the Spartan conditions of an old fishing boat, but even as the storms rage, as something that just doesn't belong there. And yet that is exactly what Jesus uses. It's a symbol of comfort that does not seem to belong in the storm. And yet we see it in other storms as well. Paul speaks of all the things that we endure in this life, certainly as people of faith, but really just living life. One of the things that we endure is sleepless nights. I think of the dark night of the soul, and I'm sure we've all had one or two of them. Perhaps some have had many, where we thrash about and hold onto our pillow like it's a flotation device. And I think of a parishioner who years ago told me about how his heart ached for an adult child who was struggling and had been struggling for so long. He said, BJ, I cry myself to sleep at night, and I pray for Jesus to help me as I think about what my child is going through. And I think of salty tears that flowed down into his pillow every single night. So much of life is not the safety of the harbor, but the storm where we are out in the midst of it and surrounded by a whole lot of other people who are out in the midst of it, fearing for their lives and wondering how to get through it. And in the midst of that, Jesus tells his friends, of course he has to be woken up to tell his friends this, that the storms are real, but I am here with you. Now, what makes the disciples afraid? Of course, yes, the storm is a scary thing. But if we look a little bit deeper than that, we realize they're fishermen. They know what a storm is. They know this is part of the deal. But what makes it particularly scary is in the moment you suddenly come face to face with what you could lose. And so they're afraid of losing their lives. Now, however good they've been at following Jesus, however much they have followed his message, however good they were at taking notes when he was giving a nice lecture on a sunny day by the shore, suddenly, when the storm is really raging, it all comes to the surface, and they realize that they are not yet where they want to be. They are in a place of a very real life, where they live in fear. And they want to protect what they know. They want to protect what they have. And yet that is what keeps them from finding true safety. Faith without fear means letting go. Even in the midst of the storm, sometimes especially in the midst of those storms. Letting go of those attachments that they have and that we certainly have as well. To ourselves, to our stuff, and to our safety. In trying to save our own skins, we lose something far deeper than that. We lose the chance to see who God truly creates us to be. We don't find safety in the harbor. We don't find that in the safety of the harbor. We find it out in the storm. The harbor is not our home. It isn't. The harbor is not our home. Our home is in Jesus, out where things aren't always so safe. Because that's where we meet the needs of the world. Because that's where we must go if our destination is something more far-ranging than that, if our destination is those wider seas of faith and adventure. The storms are real. They are terrifying. And there's a temptation to return to the harbor when we look, when the winds are raging, and we remember what seemed the perfect time back in the harbor. And we want to go there, we want to be safe, we want to go and never leave it again. But that is not what ships are for. And that's not what we have been created for either. Well, this week we were able to share some really great news. After 15 months of being apart, we will be able to come back together again on July 11th for in-person worship. I can't tell you how excited I am about that. And it feels a relief. It feels like we're heading back to a familiar place, like we're coming home again. The storm hasn't passed, but perhaps the stormiest part of it has, at least for most. But let's not move too quickly into thinking that things are normal. Let's not fall headlong into the illusion of safety, because when we do, we stop trusting in God. Last week, a colleague in ministry spoke to my seminary alumni about how this pandemic is going to impact all of our churches. Her name is Carol Pinkham-Oak. She's a priest, been a priest for many years. But as I heard this, of course, I thought about Trinity, but I thought about our lives, about how this thing that we've been going through and still are is going to continue to unfold, and how might we respond to it faithfully. She said a number of things. One, that the pandemic is going to continue and we will adapt. She said, and this really blew my mind, pandemics, if we look historically, pandemics have a 50-year impact. Can you imagine that? Sure, we're in the heart of it. This is the most acute part of it. But it's going to influence things for quite a long time. How will we adapt? How will we faithfully step into the storm where everyone around us is experiencing it and speak a word of comfort and truth? She said, we'll be unlearning as much as we are learning, and I couldn't agree more. That doesn't mean we're going to cast aside the core truths of our faith, but it does mean we're going to be asking why a whole lot more, and I think we should be. She pointed out that everyone, whether it's church folk, whether it's your family, whether it's your neighbors, it's everyone we meet, is now asking questions about purpose and meaning that they might not have been asking 16 or 17 months ago. We are all asking the question of how we are to live the rest of our lives. And if we can approach with honesty and with faith, then what we have to offer, a life in Christ, is an authentic answer. How have our lives been changed by living in the promises and gifts that God has given us? And how might that offer a word of hope to someone who's asking these questions? What about me? What about my life? Where is there meaning and purpose? But then she finally said that churches will be a place of comfort in a world filled with anxiety and fear and discomfort. And I tried to think about, where does that fit in the storm? Because there's not a lot of comfort when the storm is actually raging, and yet there is that one little piece, that pillow, that cushion, that somehow is able to reshape and reframe all that's going around. Not taking away or pretending that it's not important or it doesn't matter, but actually anchoring us in something more meaningful, more enduring, and more loving. It doesn't mean that we are to be a rest stop, to be a place of comfort. It doesn't mean that we're going to be a resort town where people can wait while the storms go back out to sea. Indeed, if we are only about the comfortable and the familiar, then we cannot hold one another's discomfort with vulnerability and love. And if we can't do that, then we are not equipped to go back out into the storm anymore. We're not actually able to offer the world a meaningful response to the brokenness of the world. So to be a place of true comfort means being able to sit with discomfort, to hold the tension of real life, and to trust, to know that Christ is there in the midst of it. Perhaps resting on a cushion, but ready to wake up and calm the storms. This, too, was comfort in the storm. It wasn't 600 thread count Egyptian cotton that you find in a fancy resort town. Rather, it was a pillow on which Jesus could rest, a sacramental cushion that suddenly reframed the whole storm itself. Most importantly, they had Jesus there with them, calming the storms, and calling them to let go of their false dependence on self, on stuff, on safety. Let these things go and trust in the eternal goodness of God. The storm is where we must go if we're planning to reach the wide open seas of faith and adventure. And I do think those words go together quite well. Long ago, Sir Francis Drake wrote, "Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas where storms will test your mastery. We're losing sight of land. We shall find the stars." The harbor and the safety of the shore, it turns out, are not the point at all. Indeed, even the storms are not quite the point either, though they are part of life, and they are where we meet Jesus most intimately. Rather, faith is about adventure. It's about the wider seas where our lives are defined not by storms or safety, but by a journey that brings us ever closer to wholeness in God. As Francis Drake addressed God, so too do we. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push into the future in strength, courage, hope, and love.